Welcome everyone to the Reading Writing Corner. I'm your host Leon, and this is the non-spoiler portion of this video for The Great Dialogues of Plato by Plato. And I don't know how non-spoilery this will be, considering if you haven't read Plato, which school did you go to and why didn't they require it, either in high school or college? Because let me tell you, it's required. It is translated by W.H.D. Rouse, and it is a standalone because it's just dialogues. I mean, there's more dialogues of Plato's that can be found out there, but this is just not a part one of the Great Dialogues of Plato or a part two or whatever. It's just the Great Dialogues of Plato. Now about this. These are dialogues written down by Plato, as he either heard them from someone else or heard them directly, and each one is about something different. Most of them are about something different. So, what made me read this book? I read some of it for college, and I wanted to see if the rest was any good, or if it was just as dull and boring as it had been before when I read it in college. Well, let me tell you, I found it dull and boring. Philosophy's not for me. Okay, the blurb I have written down is any translation of the complete text of the Republic, Apology, Crito, Phaedo, Ion, Meno, and Symposium reveals the genius of Plato as he struggled with education, justice, and the philosopher king, and utopia for visions of society. It says here on the back, Plato's dialogues comprise the most influential body of philosophy of the Western world. Written in the form of debates, the dialogues are filled with philosophy, continual search for truth, and the moving drama of intellectual conflict. The Republic, a brilliant discussion of the ideal state, presents Plato's basic views of education, justice, and the philosopher king, the wise and just prototype of a ruler who could cure the world's ills. In the dialogues, Apology, Crito, and Phaedo, the imposing figure of Socrates, Plato's beloved mentor, emerges as Socrates discusses respect for law and authority, human virtue, and the immortality of the soul. The additional dialogues contain thinking on such ageless subjects as art, virtue, and the nature of love and beauty. Each book is different from the last, and each one deals with its own subject. The only ones that have any connection are the Republic books 1 through 10, and the defense of Socrates, Crito, and Phaedo dealing with Socrates. That's that. Okay, so you're going to get tired of me saying this a lot, but I'm going to go through each book and do a little brief thing on it, dealing with, say, the setup of the characters, how they react to a certain situation, and what was more important, the character or the plot. A lot of it's going to be redundant and resaid a certain way, so bear with me. The first book or dialogue in this book is Ion, which is a conversation between Socrates and Ion of Ephesus on how Ion is unequaled as a reciter and exponent of Homer. So the setup of the characters is at the beginning of the dialogue to lay down the scene of what was being said and by who and why. What I mean by that is that it's got an introductory note, and it also tells you the basics of who's going to be in it. Socrates and Ion are in this one, and it's just telling you that they're what they're talking about in general. So it's like it's not really an introductory note, it's more like a summary of what goes on. So if you don't want to actually read the book, you can just read the summary, and it gives you the basics of what they're talking about in each dialogue / book, whatever you want to consider it. The motives are laid out in the beginning too. So like Socrates is like, what makes you an expert on Homer? And Ion's like, this is what makes me an expert on Homer. And Socrates is like, is it because of your skills as a reciter, or is it because of divine inspiration? Because you don't know how everything works that Homer recites, and neither did Homer. So like, you're not an educator, you're not a farmer, so how could you sit there and say that you are an expert on these when you're not? And so how can you talk about, like, you know exactly what Homer is saying, why he's saying it, and devolving deeper into that kind of aspect. So Socrates, of course, reacts with questions because he wants to either understand where Ion got his information about understanding or to help him realize something else. Ion just talks and tries to understand what's being asked of him because a lot of times they don't understand Socrates' conversation where he's going with it, with his questions. He asks weird ones and random ones and ones that they think sometimes are not connected to what they're talking about. So what was more important, the character of the plot for this dialogue? It was the character's conversation. That's the most important, obviously. It's just basically them talking about it. It actually says this dialogue foreshadows the views on art as a whole, which are explained in the Republic. So this one actually has more in-depth in the Republic than it does anywhere else. Yeah, so that's what that one's about. The second one is about Menno and the virtue, whether it can be taught or not. So this is between Menon and Socrates, and then Aiatos comes into it. Anytos, I don't know how to say any of these names besides Socrates and Plato. So forgive me if I'm butchering, but that's literally the only names I really know how to say. The setup of the characters is at the beginning, of course. You got your setup here saying what's going on. And it, of course, also lays out their motives, which Socrates in this one is like, what is virtue and how do you apply it? And Menon is like, this is what virtue is, or at least in my belief, and this is how it can be applied. But Socrates is like, how can you be sure? And just basically questioning everything. So in this one, it's of course the same thing. The characters, our conversation is the most important part of this dialogue. The third book or dialogue in this is the Symposium, which is a gathering of Agathon, Socrates, Phaedrus, Pausanias, Aristophanes, Apollodorus, Alcibiades, and Eryximachus, and it is about love. They discuss what is love and everything. After he's like, you're here for my victory in a play, because he gets one of his tragedies performed at a dramatic festival in the theater of Dionysus. So he's like, you're here for my banquet to celebrate me in my victory in my dialogue, my play. And they talk about love in general, which is weird, that their whole conversation is really about love. The speeches they made about love. So they probably said other things, but they only talk really about love and everything in here. So they discuss what is love, and they go around in a circle, each one speaking on what they think love is and how it is applied to the world. Of course, the characters' conversation is the most important part of that dialogue. Now, the fourth book of the dialogue is the First Republic, book 1, because it actually says book 1, even though they're not actually considered. I wouldn't consider them books, because how they could all fit in one. I mean, it could be one book in part 1 through part 10, but it's called book 1 through book 10. These ones are all going to be basically about the same. So book 1 has Polemarchos, Socrates, Glaucon, Cephalos, Adeisamantos, and Thrasymachus. And their discussion is about justice. So that's what their motive is to talk about justice at this banquet. Not in this banquet, but in this thing, in the Republic book, they talk about justice first. That's what their first book 1 is really all about, is justice. Book 2, Between the Same People, is about justice and education. Book 3 is more about the generalization of education, more actually in depth about education. Book 4 is about education and how it applies to justice. And then they go on about, well, what makes a perfect city. And book 5 is about what makes a perfect city and how would you go about living in this perfect city and who would set it up and how would it run in the perfect city with justice and education and philosophy all added together in that. Book 6 is a continuation of that about the philosophers and the perfect city and justice. Book 7 continues about the philosophy and about philosophers, justice, and the perfect city. Book 8 is the same thing, really, honestly. And so isn't book 9. And I think book 9 they talk about the tyrannic man, who is ruled by the worst class of the unnecessary desires. So actually book 9 talks about the aristocratic constitution, the timocratic constitution, the oligarch constitution, and the democratic constitution, which the aristocratic is generates into the timocratic or honor living, democratic generation into the oligarchy, the rule of the few, and the oligarchy generates into the democracy, which is the rule of people. So there's that. That's book 8. Book 9 is the tyrannic man and how he would rule the city, the perfect city. And then in book 10 is he's just talking about arts and philosophy and artists and the justice within that. It's like all over the place when they go into it. And I had to just look it up because apparently what I wrote down was not exactly everything in there. And there's, of course, didn't have a beginning for each book. Actually, what this one did was it had its own little section, like summaries. So it had a book 1 summary, book 2 summary, book 3 summary, book 4, and then there's book 5, book 6, and you got book 7, book 8, book 9, and of course a summary for book 10, and then it goes into the actual book. So if you don't want to actually read the books, you can just read the summaries and get a general idea of what they're talking about in each book. Because it's like a lot. There's a lot that goes on in there. And their motivations, of course, are laid out in it and everything. So what was more important was actually differs between which book you're reading. Book 1 through book 10 actually had their own differing of what was important for the conversation. But the most overall thing I would say with that was that they were trying to just have a general debate on what each of them thought was justice and everything. But mostly what I feel is that they always ask Socrates this, that, and Socrates explains, and they either agree or they disagree, and they put out the reasons why they agree or disagree. So most of it is mainly Socrates. It's all about Socrates. I mean, this whole book has Socrates in it. Every single one of them has Socrates. So I would say the Great Dialogues of Plato revolves around Socrates and how he hears about it. Because the Republic is actually told to or actually I think Plato's actually in this one where he's there, but he doesn't actually say anything, which is weird. Plato doesn't actually ever say anything in the dialogues in this. They're not really mentioned. The only thing that they're mentioned is that he's there. Like I heard this from this person who heard it from this person and all this stuff. He just really is a fact gathering kind of person. Now, the 14th dialogue in this, or if you want to call the Republic one whole thing, it would be the 5th, I believe. In this is Apology, which is the defense of Socrates. So the setup of the characters at the beginning of this dialogue laid down the scene for what is being said, and by who and by why, and the motivations are laid out in the beginning. And it's really, Socrates is motivated to defend himself, and the court is just there to listen, while also trying to condemn him, because the people who accuse Socrates are like gathered a court who are not impartial, in my opinion. So Socrates is trying to defend himself against the accusation of corrupting the youth and being impiety, when all he does is ask questions about the world that they live in. He knows Anytos and some others hate him, and that was why he was having to defend himself. At least in his belief, he's like, Anytos, you gathered all these people who hate me and have a trial against me. Why? What did I do to deserve this besides questioning the world and asking questions about you? He'd be like, hey, what do you think about this? You know, he's just always asking questions. This one is definitely the character's defense. Socrates' defense is the most important in this dialogue. The next dialogue is Crito, which is about Crito visiting Socrates in prison, because Socrates is in prison and he's just awaiting. Obviously, he is awaiting the what's gonna happen to him. Which, if you don't know what happens to Socrates, that'll be spoiled in the next little part that I gotta talk about, because it's literally part of the whole thing. And I really don't know how they react, because I read it. Actually, I didn't read it. I didn't read it at all, so I don't really know what Crito and Socrates talk about, because they're longtime friends, and I guess they're talking about him being in prison and what's going to happen to him, because the courts judged him and gave him a punishment. I would say the characters' conversation, though I don't know why it's there. Like, what's so important? And I mean, if you want to tell me what's so important about having Crito being here, what are they talking about? You know, that makes it important that it has to be put in it, besides the fact, oh, look at this then. I guess Crichton says something to him. They have this conversation. Crichton's like, but my dear Socrates, I have nothing to say. And Socrates goes, then let it be, Crichton, and let us do in this way, since in this way God is leading us. So their conversation might be like, what do I do about, you being sentenced by the court? That's why he's like, let God lead us. This is what God wanted. This is how God is leading us. Let's just follow along for what it is. And then the last one is called Fiedo. I think that's how you say it, which involves the death of Socrates, which it says here, 399 BC, the death of Socrates. So if you didn't know he died, it reveals it in that one. So it's actually Echocrates and Phaedon are having a conversation. He's like, you were there when Socrates drank the poison in the prison. What happened? And Phaedon's like, okay, I will tell you all about it. So there's that. And Apollodorus is in it. Socrates, Cebes, Simmias, and Criton. I don't know who Cebes and Simmias is, but they're there for the death of Socrates. So this one, of course, has the beginning, which tells you basically that it's the stories, the narrative between Echocrates and Phaedon sets up what Phaedon talks about, which is the death of Socrates. and it lays out their motives. That just you're kind of what you want to hear about what happened when Socrates died. So, how they reacted, I skimmed it, and it was, as I'm going to write this down because it appears like I didn't write it down. It appears that they cried when he drank the poison and died. Because, you know, that's how people who are friends with Socrates do. Well, people who are friends and they see someone die, of course they're going to cry. Especially since back in ancient Greek, Socrates really didn't do anything to deserve it. He was just questioning the world, and they thought he was being improper and corrupting the youth, when he was all he's doing was just encouraging them to ask questions. So really it's that, and the plot in this is most important for the dialogue because it applies to Socrates' death. The genre is considered to be historical classic because we did find out that Socrates and Plato did exist, and Plato did write all these, so this stuff is very possibly to have been stuff that actually happened. So there's that. Did this live up to my expectations? Not really. I guess I just don't like reading the classics. I am skipping which character did I like the most and what secondary character stood out the most because I see no reason to talk about that. I mean, if I really needed to, Socrates stuck out the most, but I don't relate to him at all. Because I'm not a philosopher, so I don't relate to him. Each book was written by Plato as he heard it from word of mouth, so I'm not sure if it can be considered multiple voices or not, but it did not affect my reading of what I did read. Which I did not read I did not read any of the Republic besides the synopsis, and I didn't read the Crito and Fiato. I didn't read those. So, to end the non-spoiler part of this review, I'm going to say, should you go and read this book? If you like historic classics and Plato, go ahead and read it. If you are a philosopher, go ahead and read it. Maybe you'll make more sense of it than I did. So in this, each one is slightly different on how you meet the main characters, side characters. There are no really important reoccurring characters in this, because each one is very short, so there is no sense in saying there's reoccurring characters that just pop up every once in a while, because there really isn't. So, book one, Ion. Ion totes being the best at reciting and understanding everything Homer says in his poems. Socrates asks a lot of questions on how that can be, and how Ion knows and understands what Homer talks about, if he has never done these jobs in his life, or if they could possibly be divine inspiration. Book two, Meno. Socrates is discussing with Menon what virtue is, and they're trying to figure out together if it's something that everyone has upon birth, or if it is something that can be taught, and how does one go about figuring out what virtue is, how do they have it, and whether or not they have it already, and how you teach it. Anytos comes in and talks to him. I think what Anytos says in it is very brief, but very put upon. He's like, my dear Socrates, you seem to speak ill of men easily. I would advise you to be careful. If you will listen to me, perhaps it is easier to do people harm than good in other cities, but it is very easy in this. I think you yourself knew that perfectly well. So, Anytos doesn't like the way Socrates speaks, and he's one of the accusers for the court in the apology. So there's that. The symposium, which is just a banquet, is Agathon, which wishes to talk about his tragedy, which was performed at a small banquet with people he wanted to talk with. Of course, they talk about love in this one. So Socrates, who is invited to speak, he does about love. Phaedrus, which is a friend of Plato, he has a famous dialogue on love, so he knows a lot about it, and he actually has his own separate dialogue for Plato, by Plato. Pausanias is a disciple I didn't put down, but that's okay, it's not really anything important. Aristophanes is a famous comedic poet, and Alpodros was told of the banquet and spoke of it to a friend years later after Socrates' death. Aristodemos attended the banquet with Socrates. Alcibiades was a statesman, the admirer of Socrates, because his life was saved by him at one point when they were younger in a war. And then Eryximachus does not even get a mention in the introduction of who was at the banquet, but he was at the banquet because when they show the diagram, because I do have a diagram of who's at the symposium and how they decided how to talk, because they're like, well, who should go first and how should we do this? And they're like, well, let's do this in a round robin type of way. And so there's like a diagram. Where's the diagram? Dude. I marked it somewhere. I know I marked the diagram because I marked it. Yeah. Okay. Or maybe I didn't mark it. Oh, no, I didn't mark it. Okay, but yeah, there's a diagram who shows in which order they go. So from left to right is how they read. And Phaedrus was the father of speech. He was the first one to go. And then two people didn't speak, so they were not reported to be there. Not reported on who they were, so they weren't important. Then Pausanias was the second one. And then Eryximenes actually spoke third, because Aristophanes, the comic poet, had hiccups at the time. And then Aristodemos, who reported the speeches, probably was reported them to Apollodorus. Then there were two of them that had left early. And then Agathon spoke. But then he moved to go sit by Socrates on the other side. Then Alcibiades was Sigmund's. He came in late and he was drunk and he sat next to Socrates, who spoke after Socrates. So yeah, first Socrates was the last one, and then it wasn't because Agathon, who says, "Hey, you're sitting where I wanted to sit," so he moves and sits by Socrates because for some reason he wants to sit next to Socrates. I don't know. Book 4 through book 13, which is basically the Republic, has Polemarches. He speaks about giving what is due for justice. When Socrates asks how was one to find justice, and that's what Polemarches says. He speaks about how justice is giving what is due. I noted in each one there's some certain things they say. Glaucon, he says justice is justice any more than Sati's refuge from the consequences of the doctrine that true success depends on being as unjust as possible. Then Selphie says the house where the conversation is taking place, and follow to Polemarches. Adeimantus says everybody is in fact as unjust as he can be without being found out. Is there any value in justice itself? And Thrasymachus, he believes justice is whatever suits the strongest best. So basically how the conversation kicks off and they go from there. The apology of Socrates, next one, is Socrates is defending himself against his accusers who are saying that he is corrupting the youth, and he's like, no, I'm not. I'm just asking questions about the world to them. Get them thinking. Anytos, he accuses Socrates of impiety and corrupting the youth. Melitos, he accuses Socrates of impiety and corrupting the youth. He's the one who suggests the death penalty, which the court runs with. Lycon, he accuses Socrates of impiety and corrupting the youth, and this is the first time you hear Lycon's name. Didn't know about him before. The court, the ones there to judge whether Socrates is corrupting the youth and being impiety. And to be honest, I think the court was corrupt. Crito, it's just got Socrates in it. He's in prison, and his longtime friend, Criton, goes there to speak with him while he's in prison. Fiedo. Everything below that is what I skimmed for the section. We have Ericrates, who asks about Socrates taking the poison in prison and whether Phaedon was there for it. Phaedon says, yes, I was, and he will speak about everything that he can. Apollodorus was there, but I couldn't find out what really was important about him in it. Besides that, Phaedon says he's there. Socrates, he speaks to his friends one last time before drinking hemlock poison and dying. And he's like, quit crying about it. It's the end. Sebes and Samanas, I guess, are friends of his that go there for one last time to speak to him about advice. And Criton is there to support his friend and is worried about Socrates, and how Socrates, the courts are saying that he should be quiet, but he doesn't be quiet because he doesn't let the court or anyone decide when and how he should speak. Each book was written by Plato as he heard it from word of mouth, unless he was actually physically there, like the Republic. Those who were speaking were the point of view, so there are several of them. Too many to count. My favorite character was Socrates because of his incessant need to discuss anything and everything so that he could have a better understanding of the world. I think he said that the wisest man is the one who says he's not wise at all, because then he understands that doesn't have a grasp of everything. So you're wise, you're one of the wisest people in the world if you understand that you don't know jack about anything in the world, because you can't pretend like you do. My most disliked character was actually Meletos in the Apology, because he's wanting Socrates dead and uses the court to do the work for him. I assume it was told in chronological order, but seeing how these are dialogues, it could be possible that they were placed in any order except the last 3 dialogues. It had to be, and they weren't all in order, because obviously you don't want to put those out of order. And like one of them is like the one where Apollodorus was talking to a friend 15 years later after the death of Socrates about the banquet and what happened at it, things like that. It had appropriate language for those living back during the Greek age. It did not have any foreshadowing or suspense within these dialogues. I can tell you that much. It just flat out tells you everything. There's no suspense. It doesn't build up suspense. It has no foreshadowing. I guess you could say the Apology and Credo are foreshadowing the death in Fiado, but that's it. That'd be it. There is only enough background given at the beginning of the dialogues for the person who translated the work, for the reader to understand what they are talking about, because it could get confusing, and sometimes you just gotta be like, wait, I thought you were talking about this, why are you on this? What does this have to relate with that? But apparently it relates in some way, shape, or form. Because how do you go from talking about justice, to talking about education, to talking about the perfect city, then talking about philosophers, to back to justice? How does any of that relate in any way, shape, or form? But apparently it does. The title of the book meant that these dialogues that Plato wrote out were considered by scholars and philosophers as his greatest dialogues. Don't understand it, but whatever. The cover of my book shows Socrates surrounded by people as he walks and talks about whatever conversation he was having. Maybe Plato's in there somewhere, I don't know. I don't even know if this is like something he had made or whatever to slap on there. Because who knows if they actually had covers for their books back then. What stood out as memorable was these dialogues that were written by Plato would not have been around for most of them, or hopefully written as close to the words and information that actually happened. If they are completely accurate, I have to hand it to the Greeks for their perfect memory, because you remember what somebody says in great length if they talk from one end to the other end, and it's like 5 paragraphs of them just talking. Like, wow. My favorite passage from the story is, this is said by Thermachus in the Republic, book 1, I think. Though I didn't read it, it was in the skimming summary part of it. It says, injustice, he says, is virtuous, injustice is vicious. Injustice is everywhere at the mercy of injustice, which is reviled, not because men fear to do it, but because they fear to suffer it. My favorite quote, it is in the Apology, where Socrates says, and now it is time to go. I to die and you to live, but which of us goes to a better thing is unknown to all but God. So basically he's saying whether living or dying is better. Only God knows. Only God knows the answer to that. What I thought about the dialogues in general? I didn't really care for any of them. None of them stood out as profound or anything to me, but that might be because I'm not a philosopher. In fact, if you want to know a little secret, while I was in college, I took one philosophy class, and I barely passed with a 1.7. And if you guys don't know what a 1.7 is, just think of it as a C+. And it's actually the only the lowest class that I had. So I was very close to failing that class. If I had gone 1 point lower. Because, yeah, that's what that was. So, what book did it remind me of? Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil by John Berend. Because basically his is just like dialogues and stuff of what happened in Savannah when he went to go investigate Savannah, Georgia. And this is just dialogues Plato had collected that happened in Greek. In Greece? In Greece. Yeah. Maybe. I actually don't know where these take place, but I'm going to assume Greece. Because Plato is Greek. This book is part of a series of dialogues that Plato wrote. There are more out there if you know where to look. I don't, but I'm sure you can find them. I rate this a 2 because I just don't like his dialogues. They don't excite me or inspire me or anything. I was only sad that they killed off a great philosopher because they didn't understand poor Socrates. And so that's with that. At the end of the year, I will be unhauling this book. Of course, I'm going to take all these tabs out, but, I'll probably just, give it to a little library or something for them to use. So I will see you next illusion.